Hello and good evening. Thank you for joining us and taking part in tonight's program. I'm Nick Potter, Director of Community Relations and Development for the Pueblo City County Library District. Welcome to this very special program where we host Martin Luther King III and welcome him to our community. It is my pleasure to welcome you as we broadcast live from the Robert Hogue Rawlings Public Library and host you virtually this evening. Tonight, we designed a virtual event that should be simple to access and easy to interact with. Throughout this evening, please feel free to comment or add questions. Your questions and comments will be shared at the end of this presentation with Mr. King, where he'll have time to share his thoughts and answers to your submissions. This year, we implemented viewing kits and provided each of you with some materials to create a great at-home event. I hope you are relaxed as you snack on caramel corn and enjoy your coloring book about Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights. Tonight we will celebrate literacy, lifelong learning, and Pueblo's African American history, as well as our civil rights movement here in our country and globally. A special film series and tonight's featured guests are a collection of virtual programs surrounding the Community Voices series. In addition to this program, we will release videos that tell stories of African American community members throughout our community's history. Join us every week after this program to hear stories of notable Pueblo figures like Auntie Eliza Boone, Kathy Williams, Pueblo's first African American doctors, and more. To view all programs, make sure to follow the Pueblo City County Library District on Facebook and YouTube. This event is a fundraiser for the Pueblo Library Foundation and allows the library to further deliver its mission to the community. This evening is possible because of library supporters like you and our generous community voices and summer reading sponsors. Allow me to thank the generous individuals and businesses that supported this program. Friends of the Pueblo Library, H.W. Houston Construction, Bank of the San Juans, All Phase Environmental Consultants, Inc., the Pueblo Mall, Turner Roofing, LLC, Parkview Health Systems, Security Service Investment Group, Office of the District Attorney, 10th Judicial District, Doctors Mark and Rico Clark, New Image Drywall, the Pueblo Community Health Center, Credit Union of Colorado, Royal Electric Services, and Wilcoxon Wealth Management. For everyone joining us virtually, can I get a warm round of applause for these businesses and individuals who sponsored tonight's program and made it possible? Thank you so much. Now for our featured presenter. As the oldest son of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King III serves as an ambassador of his parents' legacy of nonviolent social change. A graduate of his father's alma mater, Morehouse College, Mr. King has devoted his life to working in the nonprofit sector to promote civil rights and global human rights, and to eradicate the triple evils of racism, militarism, and poverty. Evils his father identified as the scourges of mankind. As a high school student, he served as a page to Senator Edward Kennedy. He continued his public service supporting social change movements throughout his speaking engagements, public appearances, and his writing. He was later elected as a member of the Fulton County, Georgia Board of Commissioners, representing over 700,000 residents. As the elected president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization co-founded by his father, Mr. King reinvigorated the Southern Christian Leadership Conference by stabilizing the governance, programs, and development components. As founder and president of Realizing the Dream, Inc., he took his father's message to a global audience, spearheading nonviolent trainings in Bosnia, Herzegovina, India, Israel, Palestine, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and the United States. A former president and CEO of the Atlanta-based King Center, Mr. King remains a member of its board of directors. In addition, he serves as a board member for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Drum Major Institute, a New York-based think tank, and the Metropolitan West Management Asset Corporation. Mr. King has also served as an election monitor and observer in South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. In addition, Mr. King has conducted nearly 40 poverty study tours in a groundbreaking initiative which has sparked public debate and law enforcement advocacy on the issue of poverty. In conjunction with Ambassador Andrew Young and other partners, Mr. King co-founded Bounce TV, the first independently owned and operated TV network featuring African Americans. The network's content includes movies, sports, documentaries, and original programming. The recipient of numerous awards and honorary degrees, Martin Luther King III is a civil rights activist, global humanitarian, and political leader. The Pueblo Library provided his book, My Daddy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to many school classrooms throughout the Pueblo community. We are pleased to virtually host Mr. King and look forward to hearing from him and receiving insights into his life, his experiences, personal philosophies, and literature. Mr. King, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This year, we have celebrated the rich African-American history and will continue to do so within the Pueblo community. I am so excited to hear from you and hear your thoughts on your book, My Daddy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the topics discussed within the book. Viewers of this program, please remember again that you can add your questions in the dialog box below the video. I would now like to pass the virtual microphone over to Mr. Martin Luther King Jr., to Mr. Martin Luther King III. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction. And I want to thank the library administration for inviting me to address this forum. My thanks also to the library supporters and donors and everyone who is participating in this virtual series on community voices. In preparing for my address for this forum, I learned about the remarkable diversity of Pueblo, which has been called the melting pot of the West. But the melting pot image can be misleading. Although there is a lot of blending of races and cultures in America, people are rightfully proud of their heritage and more frequently try to preserve the best traditions of their respective cultures. So I would suggest that America, and Pueblo included, is more of a mosaic than a melting pot. All the different tribes of America can preserve their heritage, even as we explore ways of working together for the great mosaic of American society. The quilt image also works well. A beautiful quilt is composed of many vibrant subsections. The ideal quilt as a whole celebrates diversity, but covers and protects us all. That's the way it should be in a great democracy that respects human rights for all people. And so Pueblo's vibrant multi-racial heritage provides an inspiring legacy of hope and opportunity for people of different races, religions, and cultures. As an African American, I particularly enjoyed learning about the Black history of Pueblo, including the role of historical figures like James Beckwourth, a Buffalo soldier who was a co-founder of Pueblo, and Cathay Williams, another Buffalo soldier who posed as a man to help defeat slavery during the Civil War. One of the wonderful things about the westward migration of people of different races and cultures, cultural backgrounds, is how they learned to work together for the mutual benefit of all. Cooperation becomes an imperative for survival. The westward migration was about new beginnings and opportunities, but it was also about learning to live together, work together, and build together. After the Civil War, the emancipation of slaves, and Juneteenth, the anniversary of which is now commemorated as a federal holiday, African Americans moved west in ever-increasing numbers. Certainly you wouldn't know it from watching most American movies about the West, but there were plenty of African American cowboys and cowgirls in the real history of the West. And today, Black Americans are an important constituency in the major Western cities. I also have some Native American heritage on my mother's side. And it's important to acknowledge that Native tribes or indigenous people were cheated out of their ancestral lands by a long trial of broken treaties. And they too experienced horrific brutality during the westward migration. And the Asian peoples who helped build the railroads and populate the West were also brutally exploited and subjected to violence and discrimination. Spanish-speaking people who have played such a prominent role in the culture of the West have experienced ruthless exploitation as part of the settlings of the West. Many history books tend to glorify the westward migration without acknowledging the violence, injustice, and brutality that was part of it. We can't deny the painful truths of history, but we are nonetheless challenged to find creative ways to work together and live as brothers and sisters and children of a common creator. Despite the inevitable differences that emerge between people of different cultures, it is encouraging that the people of Pueblo are finding new ways to build bridges of mutual understanding and cooperation for the betterment of the entire community. Black history has long been an interest of mine. As you might imagine, growing up as the namesake and son of Martin Luther King Jr., it certainly presented its own unique set of challenges, as well as benefits. On the one hand, people are generally kind and generous when I meet them. On the other hand, understandably, they have very, very high expectations, which from time to time have been very hard to meet. My father was assassinated when I was just 10 years old, and that has been the hardest part of his legacy. He wasn't just a famous leader to me. He was a warm and loving father, a real dad whose company was tremendously enjoyed and is sorely missed, and was certainly missed when he wasn't there, oftentimes having to travel around our nation and parts of our world. He had a great sense of humor and he was fun to hang out with. My mother prepared me as best she could for the kind of life I would be leading as my father's namesake. But she always emphasized that I was free to make different choices and be the private person I wanted to. The primary reason my mother worked so hard to secure the enactment of the King holiday is that she knew it would lead to millions more people studying about his philosophy and methods of nonviolence. She believed, as did my father, that nonviolence is the most powerful tool available to oppressed people in their struggles for liberation. The challenge facing everyone who believes in the dream is to spread his teachings about nonviolence worldwide. Here's what my father wrote about my mother's influence on his leadership, and I quote, "She saw the greatness of the movement and had a unique willingness to sacrifice herself for its continuation. If I've done anything in this struggle, it is because I had behind me and at my side a devoted, understanding, dedicated, and patient companion in the person of my wife. I am convinced that if I had not had a wife with the formidable strength and calmness of Corey, I could not have withstood the ordeals and tensions surrounding the movement. Educating people about my father's philosophy and strategy of nonviolence has also been a top priority in my life as well, and also for my siblings. My dad sometimes took me and my younger brother and older sister with him on civil rights movement trips so that we could see with our own eyes what he was doing to make life better for all of God's children. We came to understand the burdens of his leadership, and we all chose to get involved in making our own contributions to carrying forward his unfinished work. And today I try to do my part as the father of my daughter, Yolanda Renee King. Like my father and mother before me, my wife and partner, Andre, and I make every effort to include our daughter in the projects we undertake. In fact, on August 28th, just a few days ago, we were in Washington, D.C. for the 58th anniversary of the March on Washington, where we, along with a number of other organizations, organized over 100 marches in 41 states to expand, to protect, and preserve voting rights, because in our country, there are some states that are trying to restrict people's rights to vote. And at those demonstrations, our daughter, 13-year-old daughter Yolanda, spoke along with my wife and myself and many others at demonstrations all across this country. Now, and yes, over the years when she was very, very young, we took time to read to our daughter. And as a result, she is a voracious reader on her own, much like her grandfather. And we're making sure she understands the value and importance of libraries. Nowadays, we sometimes hear people say that libraries are obsolete because the internet can provide nearly all of the books and magazines we find in libraries. But I don't embrace that. Libraries are about much more than storage space for books. They are really community learning centers, places where people can gather and share valuable information and educate each other. As the librarian R. David Lankeys once said, bad libraries build collections. Good libraries build services. Great libraries build communities. And so it's my hope that the Patrick A. Lucero Library will continue to serve as a gathering place for interracial friendships and unity for the people of Pueblo. Let it become a matrix for a community of caring and compassion for each other and all who pass through here. I'm not knocking the internet as a learning tool. On the contrary, it is an essential tool for learning and keeping informed in today's society. But there's a saying that Google can quickly bring you 100,000 answers to your question, but a good librarian can give you the right one. Today's best libraries also provide computer access for kids who might otherwise not be able to do research online because of their family's economic circumstances. For many young people, libraries are a refuge, a place where they can find some peace and quiet with no television blaring in the background. A safe place where they can read and think about what they're reading without a lot of distractions and distracting noise. It is also a wonderful asset for the students who need some guidance to fulfill their potential. With so many bookstores disappearing from America's cities and towns, it's good that the simple pleasure of browsing among books and reading to follow your curiosity is still very much alive in our community libraries. The young adult novelist, Liba Bray, wrote that the library card is a passport to wonders and miracles, glimpses into other lives, religions, experiences, the hopes and dreams and strivings of all human beings. And it is this passport that opens our eyes and hearts to the world beyond our front doors. That is one of our best hopes against tyranny, xenophobia, hopelessness, despair, anarchy, and ignorance. My father loved libraries. In fact, he had one in our home, and we called it the study. But really, it was a library with an amazing variety of books crowding the shelves. My dad was definitely a bookworm. There's a famous photo of my father walking down the aisle in an airplane. And he's carrying 3 books for reading on the flight: The New Industrial State by John Kenneth Galbraith, The Confessions of Nat Turner by William Styron, and the Holy Bible. There's another photo I like of him sitting at his desk in the library, reading a book called The Gandhi Reader. He read everything that he could find about Gandhi. And in my father's first book, Stride Toward Freedom, he wrote that the day he began reading about Gandhi was one of the transformative days of his life. The day he began to envision a practical philosophy that could bring an end to the Jim Crow era. Yes, reading can indeed be revolutionary. I would like to suggest that it would be a great service if some space in your library could be set aside for educating people about the life, work, and teachings of Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Mahatma Gandhi and Cesar Chavez. In addition to the 14-volume Martin Luther King Jr. papers and the 7 books my father wrote, it would be good to have some copies of the DVD entitled King, a filmed record from Montgomery to Memphis, which is the best documentary yet made about my father and the movement. This is the documentary that presents over 3 hours of footage of the American Civil Rights Movement in action. There's nothing else like it. It's just an extraordinary teaching tool. I would also recommend the DVD Martin Luther King Jr., Man of Peace in a Time of War, which includes an in-depth interview with my father, videotaped in high-quality color, which certainly is rare for the era. No doubt there are many other new sources worth acquiring. And certainly you want a good collection of children's books that touch on his legacy. Since 1970, the American Library Association has presented an annual Coretta Scott King Award recognizing outstanding children's books by African-American authors and illustrators. And I'm sure my publisher, HarperCollins, would like me to mention my own children's book entitled My Daddy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is being distributed to young people who are participating. I think that it was already said in this program. Let it also include ever-increasing resources to educate each new generation about the power of nonviolence to end injustice, bring people together, and build brotherhood and sisterhood. To the students and young people who are taking part in this forum, I encourage you to learn more about the American Civil Rights Movement. Students and young people played such an important role in the Civil Rights Movement in this country. In Birmingham, Alabama, in the U.S. back in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. led citywide protests against racial segregation in public accommodations. More than 3,000 young people, some who were elementary school children, filled the jails to protest against the injustice of racial discrimination. Throughout the American Civil Rights Movement, many young people who were not old enough to vote themselves were active in helping to register voters. Much of the freedom African Americans have achieved in the U.S. so far comes from the dedication of students and young workers of all races. And so it's important to think of yourself as potential heroes and sheroes. Yes, we have a lot of work to do in meeting this challenge. I sometimes hear people complaining about how they don't make leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. anymore. Instead, we want to become leaders yourselves. History is calling your generation to lead the way to a better world. My father was once a young person with many of the same dreams and insecurities some young people have today. But he worked hard and prepared himself in a way that he was able to answer when history called. And that's what today's young people must do if we want to create a better world. Let all of us, black, white, red, brown, and yellow, people of every race, religion, and nation, join together with love and courage to make Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream a beautiful reality. My young friends, you, the young people of the 21st century, must lead our world to a new era of peace and prosperity. I know this seems like a great challenge. Remember, let me just add, just a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, our nation lost and saw a man, George Floyd, being killed in front of our eyes in Minnesota. And as a result of that tragic death, we saw millions of young people, all in every state in our nation, nonviolently for the most part, demonstrating, requesting that our nation do better and really become a better nation. Not only were demonstrations, by the way, just in the United States, but there were demonstrations in Europe. There were demonstrations in Australia. There were demonstrations in New Zealand. There were demonstrations in Canada, in South America. Really just about all over the world, there were demonstrations, by and large, led by young people. And that energy for creating a more just and humane world is not going away. And so I'm very proud of what young people did then and what I suspect you as young people will continue to do. Remember that every one of you can be great because all of you can be servants of God in justice and peace. We're counting on you to pick up the torch to leadership and help to put an end to poverty, racism, and violence. With your help and prayers and God's blessings, we can fulfill Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of a new world where freedom, justice, and peace will reign supreme among all people. And I urge all of you to become servants of your community, nation, and world. Make a personal commitment to give something of yourself to help somebody or some great cause. You can become a force for constructive social change. Every act of service to help someone, no matter how small, will make you a more fulfilled person. It will make your community and nation better, and it will create a better world for all humanity. My young friends, our world is crying out to your generation to challenge the injustices that afflict humankind. I urge you to make your unique contributions to creating a better world, where every person has a decent home, nourishment, a quality education, and good health care, and are secured those things for every person. Your generation must lead the way to a new day when all communities are free from poverty, injustice, and violence. Reach out and help one another to achieve your full potential as human beings. Resolve to blaze as human beings new trails of liberation and winning new victories for freedom and human dignity for oppressed people. Pick up the torch of leadership and light the way forward to a new era of hope and healing with peace, liberty, and justice for all people. These are great challenges, but you must have faith in yourselves and your potential greatness as servants of God and humanity. Each and every one of you can be a leader in your homes, community, nation, and world. Your generation can lead us to a beautiful new day when we can end racism and all forms of prejudice and bigotry. A new day when we can eradicate poverty, eliminate violence and war. And with your leadership and commitment, we can create a worldwide beloved community in which all people can live together in peace, love, and natural harmony as our Creator intended. And in this way, the young people of Pueblo can promote the values of love and nonviolence and the principles of justice and equality for people of all races, religions, and cultures. My father not only gave us a great dream for America, a vision of a nation united in justice, equality, brotherhood, and sisterhood, he told us and showed us how to achieve it through nonviolence. This is the legacy we must pass on to all future generations. In my father's I Have a Dream speech, he challenged all of us to live together, sisters and brothers in the human family. On many occasions, he used the term the beloved community to describe the kind of society he envisioned for America, in which every person was valued and where all conflicts could be reconciled peacefully in a spirit of goodwill and mutual benefit. It is a daunting challenge. Some would call it a utopian ideal. But a great nation should have great dreams and great goals. In meeting this challenge, America's wonderful diversity presents both our greatest strength and our most difficult problem. The diverse peoples who came to these shores from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe, and the indigenous people of our hemisphere have all made remarkable contributions to the betterment of our country and humankind. Indeed, the people of every race can point to a litany of accomplishments that have made America the hope of humanity. And yet, there is an urgent need for improvement in the way our diverse communities interact for the betterment of our country. We must do a better job of reducing conflict between different social groups so we can lay the foundation for a new era of understanding, goodwill, and cooperation that can move America forward. Like my father, I believe that nonviolence provides the strategy we can leverage to weave together an American mosaic that can help our country live up to its best ideals. Nonviolence was the key to all of the victories of the American modern civil rights movement. Everything that my father achieved as a civil rights leader, he credited to the unique power of nonviolence. In less than 13 years, the nonviolent civil rights movement won landmark reforms, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Nonviolence succeeds because it earns the respect of the community. When oppressed people refuse to retaliate with violence while resisting injustice with peaceful protest and tactics, they set a powerful example and gain credibility. Now, what is amazing as we look back on this period of history is the nonviolent discipline the movement embraced. Even though more than 36 civil rights workers were killed during the modern civil rights movement, no civil rights activist engaged in violence during this era. I encourage people everywhere to study nonviolence, to make it a cornerstone principle of social activism, and then get engaged in organized nonviolent action for needed reforms. But nonviolence is not just about protest. civil disobedience and boycotts. It's also a way diverse people can live together for mutual benefit. My father once said that we have to be together before we can learn to live together. Regrettably, today, millions of Americans rarely have any meaningful contact with someone of another race. Too many of the nation's neighborhoods and communities are still racially segregated. We can't just talk about good race relations in the abstract and realistically expect that peaceful coexistence will somehow become a reality. Sometimes it takes a real effort to reach out beyond our comfort zones to engage with someone from a different community. But it's an effort worth making because it broadens our horizons, increases mutual understanding, and provides practical experience in multicultural living. In that spirit, I encourage all Americans to broaden our circle of friendships, to include people of another race or culture. We can certainly enjoy our respective communities and still reach out to build friendship and bonds of goodwill with Americans of different races, religions, and cultures. And imagine what such a commitment on the part of millions of Americans would do for our country after 5 years. With your support, we can turn this beautiful vision of hope and opportunity into a reality. We can create the kind of community that nurtures the bodies, minds, and spirits of all of our people. When my father received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, he said, "I have the audacity to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits." This was his dream and his vision of the beloved community, not just for America, but for the world. Let this be our vision going forward as we strive to be better servants of God and humanity. As I prepare to close, I would just thank all of you for tuning in today. And let all hearts be joined together as we move forward into the future, united and determined to create the beloved community of his great dream in America and throughout the world. When I was a young child, my mother took me to her undergraduate school, Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And on that college campus was a statue of the educator Horace Mann. And on that statue, the inscription said, under Horace Mann, one that I will remember because it made such an indelible impact on my life. At probably 13 years old, but I went many more times to the school and continued to digest and analyze what the words meant. Those words said, "Be ashamed to die until you won a victory for humanity." And I thought about that and I said, oh my gosh, that's monumental. Be ashamed, again, I say, to die until you've won a victory for humanity. So I broke it down and I said, we can win a victory on our street. We may be able to win victories in our neighborhood. Some of us will win victories in our schools. Some may win victories in our city. Some may win victories in our state. Some may even win victories in our nation, and others may even win victories in our world. But all those words basically mean are be ashamed to die until you've done a little something to make the world in which we all must live a little better than it was when you arrived. Thank you, and may God bless each of you always.
Thank you so much for everything, Mr. King. I really appreciate you mentioning our local history and the impact that the library makes in our community. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to mention one person who has our first comment as well as a question, and that is the woman woman that actually wrote the paper that I sent you that talked about the Pueblo history and Pueblo's African American history. And so she is watching us this evening. Her name is Lois Conator Halp. And her question that she would like to the first one is kind of a comment, but the second one is a question. She'd really like to let you know that your father really spoke to children like her, and that and also her siblings, and that in his famous speech that he made the difference of how she approached her life. The question that she has is, she would like to know, how would your father assess the setbacks that we have suffered over the last 5 years regarding racism, social and educational and economic disparity, and overall ugly division that has permeated our nation?
So I don't know that any of us have the ability to project what he may have said or done. We can look at his writings, and I don't, he never was negative, and so he never would have thought that the work that he and others did was in vain. I think he certainly would be greatly disappointed in where we are and the setbacks that exist. But he also understood, as my mother used to say, that freedom is never permanently given, but every generation must basically continue to work to acquire freedom so that maybe one day it will become permanent. So I think Dad, now what I know is Dad would be extraordinarily proud of the millions of young people that marched after the death of George Floyd over the years. He'd be proud of Black Lives Matter. Some people misunderstand and try to take segments of what some people who say they represent Black Lives Matter, are stating. He'd be proud of the women's movement. He'd be proud of all of these emerging movements that are helping it to transform our nation. In light of the fact that there are some who are limited in their thoughts. And, an educated society, an informed society is really about expanding, not reducing it. That's what's happening with the right to vote right now. As I said, there are states all over this country, 18 so far, that have passed laws to restrict people's ability to vote. We really should be making it easier and expanding the right to vote. In fact, Americans went to the polls last year and voted in numbers like never before. And since January of this year, there have been over 400 new laws that are being proposed to be put on the books. I think 30 have been passed, as I said, in 18 states to restrict the right to vote. So if there were no problems with the election, as most experts would say, then why would we need to put provisions in place to protect something that does not exist? Now, none of that should cause us to retreat. In fact, that should cause us to be more engaged. And I think that's where my father would be. He would be more vigilant. He would be more in dialogue, more versatile and verbal. Yesterday, I was in Washington, D.C., for example, for the last 2 days. The first day, I went to deliver a letter. My wife and I, who serve as, I'm the chairman of the Drum Major Institute, and my wife is the president of the organization, along with Reverend Al Sharpton of the National Action Network. And we met with Leader Schumer, Majority Leader Schumer. Our objective also was to meet with Minority Leader, with the Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell and his office would not even allow us to deliver the letter to his office, which was requesting a meeting. So it goes to show, yes, we are disappointed, but we are not discouraged. We are engaged. We're going to continue to be engaged until we make sure that voting rights are available for all people. And that's why we're appealing to the federal government. I've probably given more information than was asked, but I'm really trying to say that, look, we have to always stay. You do have to take a break. You can't stay on the battlefield. You sometimes have to retreat and fortify yourself. and others have to be fortified. But then we have to come back out there and stay engaged, stay on the battlefield until we've accomplished the goal, which the goal is to move America forward. We should not be going backward in the 21st century.
You know, I don't think you said too much at all. You actually segued really perfectly into our next question that comes in from Judy Solano, who's a wonderful community advocate. And Judy asks, how do we protect democracy? Everything seems to be getting dismantled. Voting rights, women's rights, equality, justice. And she just wanted to thank you for your time. So I think actually it's a perfect way to segue into that question.
So one of the goals that we have, and thanks for all of these questions, but one of the goals we have is to register at least 2 million people. Coming off the marches that we did, the over 100 marches in 41 states, where we engaged millions of people. In fact, social media-wise, over 100 million people were engaged on August 28th. August 28th, again, being the anniversary of the March on Washington, where Dad delivered the Have a Dream speech, to 58 years since that. But one of the things we're going to do is we're going to register at least 2 million people. We have to keep people engaged. There is a lot coming at us. And the fact of the matter is, if we're not able to help the agenda of this administration, the Biden administration, that many Americans, more Americans supported, almost 6 or 7 million more than supported the Trump administration. Doesn't mean that the Trump administration didn't have support, but 6 million more people voted for President Biden and Vice President Harris. And what we have to do, there are midterm elections coming up. I think what we must look at is elections have consequences. And when 4 years ago, many of us or some of us didn't participate, or we didn't see a difference between a President Trump and, a Secretary of State Clinton. And so we did not vote. And the consequences were the Supreme Court now has 6 members who are ultra conservative, who are not even looking the rights of women. I mean, how, we see all of these things happening in front of our eyes. We see voting rights attempting to be taken away. The way we overcome that is we are vigilant and determined. We can't give in. We can't give up. We can't give out. We have to be more vigilant than ever, registering and voting, no matter what they attempt to do to restrict our abilities to vote. That is how important it is to elect people to office who understand, that we want to protect and preserve our children, who understand that we don't want to discriminate against anyone, regardless of who they are, who understand that, even the president's trying to get a jobs bill through with the infrastructure bill. If he does not have the support in Congress, none of that's going to be done. And that election will be taking place just next year. So it's imperative that we stay engaged, even though sometimes we feel like, we may be tired. As I said, if you're tired, take a break for a few days, but please come back out and get engaged. And again, I am so proud of all the young people that we saw last year. It's so tragic that George Floyd had to lose his life. A police officer, one officer, and 3 others, but the main officer became judge, jury, and executioner all in one. And yet he's been convicted, which is good. The other 3, we'll have to see what happens with the justice system. But my higher point is that because of that tragedy, and the whole world was able to see it, people came out and protested. And many of those were young people. We've got to find a way to keep those young people engaged, because if young people stay engaged, we will not, as a society, go backward.
Thank you, Mr. King. We have 2 more questions. The next question that came in asks, how do you see the COVID-19 pandemic changing, exacerbating, or highlighting human rights issues in our country and the globe?
Wow, I don't know that I can answer that. I can give an opinion, which is because I'm certainly not an expert. It is certainly my hope that we as a society can formulate a true cure, because the vaccines that are out there may be creating some degree of stability, but there's not a cure yet. So, and then of course there are more strains of COVID, several more that keep reinventing themselves. So I hope and pray, number one, that we figure out how to manage and navigate our lives right now are interrupted in a way that we maybe could not totally predict, although there had been predictions that there could be a pandemic. We've had pandemics throughout the history of our world from time to time. I have to believe that this one we will get through also. Certainly there are disparities in communities of color where the ability to treat this virus has been disproportionately administered, and the goal is for everyone to have the same access, or should be. That is the absolute goal. We have to work to make sure that that happens, so that poor communities have the same access that wealthy communities have, so that the Black and brown community and the indigenous, mostly important population, those who were here before any of us, all have the same rights. We have to constantly engage with our elected officials so that that happens. It is not a task that we cannot achieve. And in addition to that, poor countries around the world, we're doing some things as a nation, but I think we have to even do more. This is a crisis that is probably not going to go away in a year or two. But just like almost anything, we as a human species have the capacity to overcome almost anything. And so I'm convinced that that we will ultimately, don't know how long, overcome, or we have the potential to ultimately overcome this severe crisis, this global severe crisis.
Thank you. And our final question of the evening is, last month you joined forces with Alejandro Chavez, grandson of Cesar Chavez, to provide a powerful march on for voting rights. Can you talk a little about the effort to partner with Mr. Chavez to respond to voter suppression laws?
Certainly. Well, first of all, I was honored to join Alejandro and the people of Phoenix, where he resides and works, and he's done an amazing job of lifting up the rights of oppressed people, Chicano people, workers, basically workers in general. He actually works with an organization called March On, and our organization, the Drum Major Institute, along with the National Action Network, along with March On and Futures Coalition, are the ones who did the marches, the 100 marches in 41 states. That was an amazing demonstration of people being engaged. And, I cannot say enough about Alejandro Chavez. I will say, of course, my father had great respect, and Cesar Chavez joined my father and later on my mother as he led the movement for workers' rights, those who were picking grapes and lettuce and all the different things that need to be picked. And yet, we treat people, again, we have a history as a nation of treating people of color so badly, and poor people. This is not to put us in the box of being victims, but it is a context. You have to contextualize history. It is said that a people that do not know their history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. So from a contextual standpoint, when we look at what has happened to communities of color, and understand how they've all been mistreated, it is high time for us to change that. And those are areas where Alejandro is working. Those are areas where I'm working, and many other people who are involved in this movement. It's not about one ethnic group, but it's about, it's not about collective guilt, but it's about collective responsibility. We have to work to eradicate these things. My dad talked about the triple evils of poverty, racism, and violence, and eradicating them from our society. And these are areas that we still have, as a society, a lot of work to do. It does not mean we've not made progress, but we certainly are nowhere near where we should be by this time. Had Dad lived, had Robert Kennedy lived, certainly had Malcolm X lived, had Medgar Evers, had John F. Kennedy, our whole world would be different. We'd be on a totally different trajectory. But because profound men were gunned down, leaders, I should say, were gunned down in the midst of their movements for change, our country chose to go in a different direction. And so what is perhaps needed today is, again, the constant engagement of young people from around our nation and the world joining together, because we know that this government is really supposed to be of, for, and by the people. And if the people are silent, nothing happens. But when the people come together and get engaged, changes occur. And that's what can potentially make us truly a great nation. We've had spurts of greatness, but I personally believe that my father talked about to make America become the nation that it ought to be. There's some, including Ronald Reagan, who had a slogan of greater land that Mr. Trump borrowed. And, but most of us, or many of us, I'd say, don't know when that period was. I can't say that, well, was America great then? Well, how can you say you're great and you're mistreating your women? How can you say you're great and you're mistreating Black folk? How can you say you're great and you're mistreating Latino and Hispanic people? How can you say you're great when first and foremost you mistreated Native Americans or the indigenous population that was here before any of us? So all of that has to change and be transformative. And then maybe we can become the nation that we ought to be.
Mr. King, thank you so much for joining us. It was a great privilege to host you this evening and to hear your inspirational words.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Truly appreciate it.
Our community is honored to have someone of your esteem address all members of our community. Thank you again.
Thank you.
I'd be remiss to not thank people who really made our Community Voices series that you will see later on this week in this month possible. And those members are Lois Conatori-Haupt, Ray Brown, Lucille Corsentino, Rebecca Atkinson, Roxana and Reverend Steve Mack, and Kennedy Pugh. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope you left here feeling inspired and ready to change the world for the better. If you just couldn't get enough of our conversation this evening and would like to hear more from Mr. King, join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. for another presentation. You can access tomorrow's program on the Pueblo City County Library District's YouTube and Facebook pages. Thank you, and have a great evening and good night.